In one of the most remote corners of the world, where ancient forests stretch for miles and the silence fills the air with its eerie void, there was a small, forgotten settlement called Arkdale. It wasn't marked on any maps, and only the rare traveler might accidentally stumble upon its silent streets, lined with grim houses made of darkened stone. The residents of Arkdale rarely left their homes, and those few who dared to step outside moved like shadows, silently avoiding encounters with their neighbors. It was said that this place was once lively and prosperous, but everything changed after one strange event that people now preferred not to remember. The entire village was enveloped in a thick, impenetrable mystery, and each new day brought only an increasing sense of dread. Among the villagers lived the Carson family, father Richard, mother Emily, and their two children Lydia and Jacob. They had moved to Arkdale a few years ago, seeking to escape their turbulent and dangerous life in the big city. Richard was a former detective who, after a particularly unpleasant case, decided it was time to leave the past behind and start fresh. Arkdale seemed like the perfect place for that, but they soon realized that things in this settlement were far from simple. From the very beginning, they felt the unfriendly gazes of their neighbors. Richard dismissed it as the reserved nature of the locals, who likely weren't used to new faces. However, each day it became harder to ignore the oddities surrounding their new home. At night, soft rustlings could be heard outside, and Lydia swore she saw strange figures flitting through the woods behind the house. One evening, as Richard and Emily were putting the children to bed, Lydia suddenly spoke about her strange dreams. She described seeing a woman in a long black dress standing by her bed, whispering incomprehensible words. Lydia was convinced it wasn't just a dream, but something more. Jacob also started talking about strange shadows he saw on the walls of his room, even though there was no light or fire to cast them. Despite his skepticism, Richard couldn't completely ignore what was happening. His detective instincts, long dulled, were now reawakening. He began investigating the history of this place and soon discovered that the settlement was founded many centuries ago, back when ancient cults still existed, worshipping shadows and darkness. These cults conducted rituals to summon power from the depths of darkness, which led to a series of strange and inexplicable events, including the disappearance of entire families. The deeper Richard delved into the village's history, the more he realized that the settlement existed not only in the ordinary world but also on the boundary between reality and something far more sinister. One night, while studying old maps and records, he came across a mention of a certain ancient artifact, the Book of Shadows, which was believed to be the source of all the darkness enveloping Arkdale. Emily, seeing her husband becoming increasingly obsessed with this research, tried to stop him, but she soon began noticing strange things herself. Her reflection in the mirror sometimes seemed to have a life of its own, lingering for a moment longer than it should. Objects in the house started moving on their own. Everything pointed to the fact that the house or the settlement itself was under the influence of some force, and Richard was convinced it was connected to the Book of Shadows. He decided that the only way to save his family was to find the book and destroy it. His investigation led him to an old, abandoned mansion on the edge of the forest. This house once belonged to the founders of the settlement and was the center of all rituals. It was said that the book was sealed in the mansion's basement, but no one dared to go down there. Richard knew this was his only chance, and taking a lantern and an old revolver, he set off for the mansion. Emily stayed with the children but couldn't sit still out of fear for her husband. As Richard wandered through the gloomy and dusty corridors, Emily heard someone knock on their front door. When she opened it, she saw the woman in the black dress, the very one Lydia had described. The woman didn't speak, but Emily felt a coldness that pierced her to the bone. Meanwhile, Richard found the entrance to the mansion's basement. He was prepared for what might await him there, but what he saw exceeded all his expectations. The basement floor had an enormous circle carved into it, covered with ancient symbols, and in the center lay the very book. It seemed alive, its pages rustling as if stirred by an invisible wind, and from within came a whisper. Richard knew the book was the key to everything, but as soon as he approached it, the circle around it glowed, and the shadows, which had seemed to surround everything all along, began to thicken. He realized it was a trap, and the forces inhabiting this place wouldn't let him simply take the book. In desperation, he tried to destroy the book, setting its pages on fire, but the shadows extinguished the flames without a trace. The book seemed to be toying with him, and each step he took only brought him closer to the abyss, beyond which there was no return. Meanwhile, back at the Carson house, the situation had reached a boiling point. The shadows in the house had come to life and began attacking Emily and the children. They were forced to barricade themselves in one room, but they knew it wouldn't protect them for long. Lydia started repeating the words she had heard in her dreams, and Jacob realized that these were the very words they had read in the book found in the mansion's basement. Richard, understanding he couldn't destroy the book, tried to use its power against it. He began reciting incantations, hoping he could close the door he had accidentally opened. However, the shadows grew more aggressive, and at one point he felt they were about to engulf him. But then, unexpectedly, the whisper in his head was replaced by another voice, Emily's voice. She, in her despair to protect the children, had also started repeating the words Lydia had heard in her dreams. These words, as it turned out, were the key to sealing the darkness. The book began to resist, and Richard felt his strength waning. The shadows started retreating, but the book seemed to be draining his energy. In a final act of will, he grabbed the book and threw it into the center of the circle, where it began to burn with a bright flame. At that moment, the darkness enveloping Arkdale began to dissipate. The mansion collapsed, as if tired of its long existence, and Richard lost consciousness, feeling his strength leave him. When he woke up, he found himself in a hospital. Emily was sitting next to him, holding his hand tightly. She told him that after the mansion collapsed, the darkness receded, and the shadows that had tormented their house disappeared. Arkdale was finally freed from the curse. However, Richard knew that his battle wasn't over. He felt that although the book had been destroyed, the evil it carried hadn't vanished completely. It had been sealed deep within him, and he understood that his family was now bound to this evil forever. They left Arkdale, abandoning the place for good. The settlement slowly began to come back to life, but no one knew what had happened there. The Carsons continued their lives elsewhere, but the shadows of their past stayed with them forever.